Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream Mystery of Ignatius podcast. Today, I'm joined by PhD candidate Jack Bull and Dr. Robert M. Price. How are both of you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, doing great. Yeah, despite
Excellent.
the nasty weather here, which sort of had me down, but snapped out of it. Yeah.
All right, so we're talking about the historical Ignatius and his letters. Jack Bull has discussed Ignatius extensively in prior episodes. Today, we're going to be having another discussion with Bob Price here and get his thoughts on what he thinks about Jack Bull's understanding of Ignatius. So why'd you take the mic, Jack?
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the things that got me into Ignatius was that it seems to be the least spoken about apostolic father that we have. He seems to be the least spoken about, but yet he gives us the most amount of material, if you believe the 7 letters, right? More than Polycarp, more than the Shepherd of Hamas, all of these figures, we get most in Ignatius. And so the question then arises is, why is no scholar talking about him? And I don't know about you, Dr. Price, but that's something that struck me, is that compared to literature again on the Didache or the Epistle of Barnabas or Diognetus or whatever, you get loads of commentaries, you get material. But when I started my work on Ignatius, we only had 2 commentaries of any good that I could find. And all of these commentaries and any work that's done on Ignatius was only on the 7 letters in the middle recension. And so when I came to the topic, as far as I was aware, they were the only ones that existed, because that's the narrative that scholarship has just taken as correct. And so then when you look back and realize who settled this debate and when it was settled by Lightfoot and Zahn, 1889, you realize that it's a very long time ago this was settled, and it's not like scholars to put a subject down and not question it again for 100 years. But yet that seems to be where we've got to with the Ignatian epistles. So my research then led me to the 3-letter collection, the collection published by William Cureton, which only gives us Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans, but in a shorter form than we have in the middle recension. And I began conducting both a stylistic and a lexicographical analysis of these epistles to see whether they were the same as the 7, whether they shared common material, common stylistic elements, common lexicons. And it very quickly dawned on me, as it dawned on my supervisor Marcus Vincent 3 years ago, that they don't, and that the author of the 7 presents such a radically different picture of Ignatius than the 3 on subjects like Christology, the threefold ecclesial hierarchy. Analogies also differ. So the analogies that Ignatius likes to compare Christians to in the 3 letters is combative imagery, things like the athlete who is struck and overcomes adversity. But then in the 7 letters, he moves to medical themes. The communion, for example, is the antidote to mortality. You know, if you eat and drink the flesh of the Lord, you'll be immortal, and there's some great elements that you'll be incorruptible, and all these sorts of things. And so, the question of the Ignatian epistles then gets even more strange: is that not only is there very little material on the 7 letters, and there should really be more, but there really is none on the 3. Is that something you've come across? Is that something that resonates with you as you've gone through the years?
Well, are the 3 shorter versions of 3 of the 7?
Yes. So in the 7 we get, now here you go, test my memory now. You get Polycarp, Ephesians, Romans, which are the 3 that are shared with the 3-letter collection, but in a shorter form. And then in addition to that, you get Trallians, Magnesians, Philadelphians, Smyrnaeans, and I've got 7. There you go, that's 7. And not only are they vastly shorter, so when you're looking at just Polycarp, Romans, Ephesians, right, in the 7-letter collection, so the so-called middle recension, you're looking at around maybe 4,000, 5,000 words. You break it into the short recension, that goes down to 1,700. Mostly from Ephesians. Most of Ephesians is gone. including some of the key chapters. For example, the concluding chapters of 20 and 21, which talk about, how I'm going to miss this person, I'm going to miss that person. And it ends abruptly with just a story in Ignatius Ephesians 19 about how there are 3 mysteries of great renown that deceive the devil. And then it just ends. Just the end of the epistle, just absolutely out of nowhere. Similarly, in the letter to Polycarp, the last 2 chapters of that are missing in the 3-letter collection. Again, instead of ending, Polycarp, I salute you, and you're great, and I think highly of you, and I also look forward to the one who's going to be sent in my place to Antioch to look after my church. That's gone. All we get is, I salute the one going to Antioch. The end. And so, one of the questions then that struck me was, who has taken that out? We often look back at early Christians, and I think as a scholarly community, and sometimes assume a naivety, or perhaps even a stupidity among them. But that's a false thing to think. I mean, these guys were just as clever as we are, just as competent as we are. And so the idea that someone would have taken a text of Ignatius and gone, I'm going to make it end really stupidly and abruptly, or make it worse, or in addition to that, not just remove things that stylistically make it not so good, removing the name of Jesus out of the text, removing theologies about Jesus being God, removing deacons and presbyters from the text. Who's doing that? Now, according to Lightfoot and Zahn and other advocates of the 7 letters, the answer to that question is a late 2nd century monk. Well, I mean, look, no Christian's taking Jesus out of a text, Lightfoot. Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely theory. But anyone who advocates for this must state that that's the case, that a Christian of some form removed these things, which to my mind is absolutely untenable.
So there's nothing that appears to be heretical from any known viewpoint of early Christians?
It's, the way you speak of that that Catholic whitewashing of texts, that is exactly what Ignatius in the 7 letters is. He is Mr. Proto-Catholic. He embarrasses Polycarp on many levels. He makes Polycarp look like a heathen in terms of how Proto-Catholic he is. And yet someone, instead of whitewashing the text to make it more Catholic, they've taken it out. They've got rid of stuff. And again, even if you're a heretic, let's say you're a Marcionite or a follower of Valentinus or Apelles or Ptolemy or whoever, you're still not going to take out the name of Jesus.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. Who, and benign things as well. So my first thought was, let's look for big theologies. What's missing? And they're 2 of the key ones. But then the problem is, and the grunt work of this job actually comes in counting words. How many times a word is used? In what sense is it used? So, for example, looking at prepositions like kata, is it used with the accusative only, or is it sometimes used with the genitive? Other prepositions that give away a style, things like ara, un, kai even, well, kai's a bit more of a complex one, but those sorts of things. So I then began to look, counting words, really long, laborious process. And what we find is that the man in the 3-letter collection has a completely different style to the man in the 7-letter collection. Again, we're not even now talking about things that, as you would say, we deem heretical or not heretical. We're talking about how one of them loves the preposition horis, separate or apart from. In the 7 letters, that is the bee's knees. They love that word. In the 3-letter collection, it's gone. Well, hold on. We're not talking about a theology here, and that is indicative of so many other problems I found with similar words. Benign words arbitrarily removed for reasons that I can't see. There's no backing behind it. There's no reason or rhyme.
So in the manuscripts of the 3-letter collection, just so I understand this correctly, all the material that a Christian wouldn't have taken out of the 7-letter collection, if the 7-letter collection were earlier, are basically missing from the 3-letter collection. No Jesus.
So Jesus is mentioned. Let me be clear. Jesus is mentioned, obviously, and he is around. He's all over the place. But the point is that they've moved remove passages about Jesus,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
But not ones that state a theology either way, right? So it's not like it says Jesus was descended into Galilee in the 9th reign of Tiberius, like Marcion would have it, right? We don't get anything like that. It's something like the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, or praise to Jesus. Well, hold on, who's getting rid of that? And for what purpose? In addition to that, then, and now mentioning Marcion, we might also look at the canon. When you look to, and this is why I became so interested in Ignatius really in its beginning, is because Ignatius is one of the pillars of scholarship to date the New Testament. Despite the fact that nobody wants to bloody write on Ignatius, they want to use him all the time to help date Matthew, and in particular 1 Corinthians and Ephesians, and sometimes Romans, as as first century texts. Now, let's assume again with our friends who advocate for the 7-letter collection that their version is true and is 107, 110, something like that. What you're then saying is, because here's another pattern we noticed, is that canonical references and allusions are removed in the 3 letters. Sorry, what? Every reference to Paul's texts and Matthew is removed by someone at the end of the 2nd century, after Irenaeus, after some of these guys who have been massive proponents of it. Someone has then said, actually, no, we'll do away with that as well.
Whoa.
Again, it's not just a gospel thing, it's a Pauline thing. What makes more sense to me is that someone at the end of the 2nd century thought, oh no, Ignatius, stalwart figure of early Christianity, doesn't know who Paul is, or at least he mentions him by name only after Peter. Peter's number 1, Paul number 2. But he doesn't know any of his epistles. He doesn't know any of our Gospels. In fact, he doesn't know a single bloody word of the New Testament, period. Oh dear. Now, what's really interesting is, and this is where the third curveball comes into the whole Ignatian question, and something that Marcus and I had not really thought about properly, was that there's also another letter collection of Ignatius, a 13-letter collection.
Yeah.
There is also sort of a 15 and a 17-letter collection, but we put those to one side. Yeah, so not only do we get these other letters in the 13, the first letters that we have published in the semi-modern era in the 1500s were that of Ignatius to the Virgin.
Yeah.
And the Virgin's response. And also to St. John. But everyone knows that they are just phooey. I mean, no one's in any agreement. Everyone's in agreement that they're just phooey. But these other 13, which are widely regarded as phooey and spurious texts, everyone dismissed them, right? Everyone said, well, we just put them in a box. But for the same reasons as we dismiss those, we have the same arguments in favour of dismissing the 7-letter collection, because the 13-letter collection introduces canonical quotes, it introduces proto-Catholic, or at that point, fully fledged Catholic doctrine. It anachronistically applies all sorts of mad things into the past. So why is it the case we can do it once with the text that we don't want, but with the text that we do want, somehow we have a different standard of measurement?
Well, probably because Zahn and these other guys, Hort, they were Protestants, not Catholics. Like I believe Calvin dismissed the largest collection because Virgin Mary, I don't know. I mean, he wouldn't have been anti-Mary or anything, but obviously that's going in a direction he didn't like. Well, earlier on, it's successive stages of Catholicizing Ignatius. So that makes a lot of sense.
Right. Calvin says that nothing is more ludicrous than Ignatius wrote these letters. That's how strong he feels against them. But in the case of Zahn and Lightfoot, I mean, you're right. They're Protestants, they're bishops, and a lot of the stuff that's removed in the 3 letters that Cureton proposed as the genuine is about bishops. Right? There's a lot of stuff removed about it. But now it's important to know that Cureton was actually also a clergyman and a Protestant, so he actually also has a skin in the game. So it was.
Yeah, what's not to like?
Yeah, exactly. So, but he's just trying to argue from a genuine position. But then the plot gets even thicker. So the Syriac, the 3-letter collection is only in Syriac, but we know that it came from a Greek translation. that's clear by both the style and some of the transliterated words that clearly the scribe didn't want to bring over, which is fine. But that does make it sometimes difficult to compare apples and oranges with the Syriac and the Greek.
Mhm.
Now, the 13 letter collection we get in Latin and Greek. And there's a longer form and a shorter form of the 13 letter collection. And one would think that, okay, well, at least we've dismissed those now. That's happy days. We can put those out of the way. But my research has led me to believe that sometimes it's the 13 letter collection that shows the oldest form of the text.
Hmm.
And I give you an example. And this example, when I first heard it, I rang my supervisor immediately and said, Marcus, I need to tell somebody this, and you're the only person in the world that's going to care. In every one of Ignatius's letters, and I mean every one of them, regardless of letter collection, regardless of recension, whichever one it is, Ignatius begins every one of his letters with Ignatius, Ho, Kai, Theophorous. Ignatius, that is also Theophorous, this crazy name that he gives to himself, which is also a nonsense. Except in one epistle, and that is Polycarp, Ignatius' letter to Polycarp in the 13 letters. In that letter, he calls himself Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch. No Theophorus. And yet, even every other epistle in that letter collection, he calls himself Theophorus. So that strikes me that the scribe's being genuine, number one. He I don't think he made that up. I think he read it as he saw it, because otherwise why didn't he just change it to suit all the rest of them, which makes sense. But also, we know that Theophorus, when we try and track that name as attributed to Ignatius, doesn't really pop up till the 7th century. What you often get in lots of the text is God-clad, clothed with God. So now we've got 3 ways that Ignatius chooses to introduce himself: clothed with God, Bishop of Antioch, and Theophorus. So which one seems the most likely? Well, both of the other two, I think, to speak of oneself in those terms is probably slightly arrogant and poses to me maybe a difficulty. I don't know. But the Bishop of Antioch, I mean, if that's what he believed what he was, and I think he does believe that's who he is, well, this seems fairly reasonable. But like I say, that poses a problem. Now it seems that all letter collections and recensions of Ignatius have something to offer in a critical edition, which has never been done for Ignatius. In fact, most of the manuscripts have never been collated or looked at for Ignatius, which is extremely disconcerting. I have found over 80 manuscripts with at least 9 different letter collections in perhaps 5 different recensions. There's not just the 3 recensions or the 3 letter collections. This is how many we're dealing with. These texts have been transmitted so much with such varying lengths and content that we're not even close to knowing Ignatius. We're not even halfway there yet, and this has got to be a problem for scholars.
So you're basically saying that each recension of Ignatius was altered, basically, and you have to compare them to try to reconstruct what the original one looked like.
Yeah, it's a massive game of spot the difference. Now, the problem is, though, it's a massive game of spot the difference over at least Syriac, Greek, Latin, Coptic, Arabic, and so now we're dealing with several languages. Then on top of that, we're dealing with over 50 manuscripts, because I assume there's more that I haven't found. Right? I have to assume that's the case. I can never. There's not going to be less than I found, as stupid as it sounds. Then we have to deal with, okay, I've now got the collections and the languages, but the manuscript families even show corruption amongst themselves. So there are some that are clear cut, right? There are some that clearly there's a family there, and we could probably dismiss those during the later parts. But some of the families seem to corrupt into each other. We get one clear line and one clear line, and then all of a sudden they come together, and then sometimes they separate again. And you think, well, how has that happened? And so I was writing a proposal to do an AHRC grant. For those people who don't know, it's basically getting money to do research, to create the first ever critical edition of Ignatius. But unfortunately, we no longer have an institution because my supervisor has left our department at King's College, and I now no longer have someone to help me. The problem is as a PI, if you wanted to be the principal investigator of this subject and do this project, you have to know a lot of languages.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
You've got to know a lot of stuff. Now, I have Greek and I have Syriac and a little bit of Latin, but again, Coptic, Armenian, Arabic, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. We know there's more. Ethiopic is another one. So, but this has to be done, because if any work has to be done, if any work's going to be done on Ignatius, we've got to get a critical edition to at least try and get close to the opening text of where we all began. Because I do think, and I think this is contrary to my supervisor's position and the majority who hold, like Reinhard Hübner, Thomas Lechner, some of these other guys that have commented on Ignatius critically, I think there's a kernel of genuine Ignatian here. I think there are some Ignatian things here. But it may well be impossible to find out what that is in the same way we have with the Pauline literature. I think there's genuine Pauline stuff. I just don't know where it is yet. I might never know.
I think you make a strong case, because the more I think about it, it's like, well, a whole lot of work has been done here to alter Ignatius in different ways. And that kind of implies there is an original that each recension is trying to alter.
Yeah, and it's also clear. So one of the other things that's clear. So this has been. I'm now in the final stage of my PhD, and it's getting exciting because I can't wait to finish. But also because I'm looking at the reception of Ignatius in the Apostolic Father, in other early Church Fathers. So both in the Apostolic, i.e. Polycarp, and in later figures like Athenagoras and Theophilus and Clement of Alexandria and all these sorts of guys. They are all convinced. Ignore Polycarp for the moment because there's questions about his epistle and interpolations and whatever. But the rest of them are all convinced that they have something of Ignatius. They all think they have something there. One of the interesting people in the question, though, is Irenaeus. He quotes Ignatius anonymously, which is extremely odd. He says, as the great Martyr says, and then quotes from Romans. This is the biggest stumbling block to anyone who wants to say there's genuine Ignatian material, is because if anyone's going to know Ignatius, one would assume it's Irenaeus because he knew Polycarp. And if Polycarp knows Ignatius, so the lineage continues. So to quote him anonymously is strange. There's no denying it. But there does seem to be evidence that these other guys at the end of the 2nd century do know him. And Origen knows him. But what does Origen know? What does Theophilus know? What does Irenaeus know? Athenagoras know? They know the 3-letter collection. They do not know the 7. They haven't got a clue. Origen doesn't know the 7. Now, jump forward to Eusebius. He does know the 7, but only quotes 3 as Ignatian. He quotes Simonians in a completely different headspace. He's not entirely sure. How have we gone 300 years, or maybe 200 years since the writing of these things, and we still only really know the 3? There's sometimes the odd allusion to the 7, but it's not concrete. It's not obvious. The concrete ones are always to the 3 again. And again, you would have to say that if this text, and in particular if Polycarp quotes it, which I think he does, maybe, not sure, then you'd have to say these texts were at least 140. And now we're getting very close to the time of Ignatius himself.
This is it relevant, the issue of whether, like, what do you make of the fact that though he's venerated as having been taken to Rome for some reason to be executed, there is a much later attestation of his having been martyred at home in Antioch, which would kind of make more sense if you're trying to tell people, this guy, what he did, this is why he's being killed, don't let this happen to you. So the idea being that perhaps even though it's a late date of attestation, it's the old which is more likely to be historical, the more spectacular or the more modest? And the whatever his name was that wrote the Supernatural Religion, he's the one that brought this up and said, based on this, the whole Roman execution thing must be false. That kind of dispute of the survival of different martyrdom traditions, is that in any way like this kind of confusion with all the different versions of the writings?
Yeah, so if you believe in the seven-letter collection, you must accept the traditional martyrdom story of Ignatius, that he is arrested in Antioch and he goes on this mad journey all through Asia Minor and Greece and eventually ends up in Rome to be killed. Along the way, he's given 10 soldiers dedicated to his care. That's a lot of money and expense. And he's allowed visiting parties from other Christians to write letters and spread them out. Okay, I mean, I don't think you have to be a genius to think that sounds slightly fruity.
Yeah.
Person's saying that these guys are like vicious leopards that are always harassing him. Wait just a second, let me finish this thing with the Smyrnaeans. It does seem like
and the one.
Go on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please go on.
Okay, I was just going to say real fast. It's bothered me for a while that the 7-letter collection kind of sounds like like, let's have 7 letters of Ignatius, just like we have 7 letters of Paul. I'm like, is that just a freak accident?
Or the 7 in Revelation?
I think it's weird though that I think one thing I do find weird is, and it's clearly something that the editor of the 7 letters, of the 13 worked out, is that not all of the Pauline churches are mentioned. And so when you get to the 13, we then get a Philippians added in there for good measure, because clearly they've thought, that's a connection we have. But in the case of like the Trallians, Smyrnaeans, Magnesians, Philadelphians, they are a bit rogue, to be fair. Now, in the question that you posed, Dr. Price, about the mystery then, in the 3-letter collection, we don't get this mad narrative that he's sailing from Neapolis and Troas and blah, blah, blah. We don't get that. We do get that there are 10 leopards. We do get that bit. And we get that he's going to Rome. Now, I read an interesting book, although he's categorically incorrect, by a guy called Roger Parvu in his 2008 Ignatius of Antioch and Other Epalian Writings, or something it was called, where he argues that Ignatius was an Epalian bishop, which I mean is completely illogical, because he clearly also hasn't worked with the 3-letter collection. He only knows the 7. But anyway, in it he says that is it possible that Ignatius was actually arrested in Asia Minor, maybe let's say Smyrna, for example, and transported to Antioch to be killed. That's what he says. And he argues the letter to the Romans was originally addressed to the Antiochians, and the letter to Polycarp was originally addressed to the new bishop in Antioch. Now, both those things are false. And if you believe in the 3-letter collection, those things are demonstrably false and can't be true. But one thing that can be true is the starting element of his point, which is that Ignatius is not arrested in the east, but on his travels in the middle, somewhere again halfway point between Rome and Asia Minor, Greece area, right? Like that's possible. At which point you can then see why Ignatius might have gone from sort of Middle East to West rather than Far East to the West. And that to me is a more tenable position, and it's open in the 3-letter collection to that position. That's quite that's definitely possible in the 3 letters. But unfortunately, that is a pure guess, and anything will be a guess because the letters don't provide enough information to go one way or the other. In terms of the later stories, we get so many stories about Ignatius that, because for some reason he becomes like a great cult martyr who is loved and adored. I mean, Socrates even says that he was the one that created singing in church because the angels lifted him up to heaven and let him hear the songs of God. I mean, yeah, whatever. But what's interesting is then it all falls silent on the Ignatian front at the councils. No one ever uses him to justify their positions. No one uses him to argue against Arianism. No one uses him to argue against Apollinarius. No one ever talks of him again. Nobody wants to talk about Ignatius. He's like the secret guy we don't want to talk about. And everyone talks about Polycarp. For goodness sake, the man only wrote one flipping letter, and it's not even that long. Ignatius wrote 7 at least, according to advocates of the 7-letter collection. and they're full of deep, rich material about how the Father and Jesus' relationship are sort of one, but they're separate, and he's like a morning star, and all this the Eucharist is his body and his blood. Why are we not? Surely that's helpful for you guys, right? This is class A material, but it's gone again. So later stories are very complex and not to be trusted, because they all make things up, and they sometimes not even subtle. they just yeah, God lifted him into the throne room, and now he sings in church, and now you do too because of Ignatius. You're welcome. I don't think so.
We have a super chat question from Elias Almaty. Thank you for your super chat. My question is, outside of Ignatius and Aristides, which fathers have the most interpolations in the manuscript tradition? Maybe the Byzantine texts, harmonizations of Irenaeus, Didache fragments, Polycarp.
I think that's the easiest question, but I've been doing a lot of talking, so Robert, I'll let you go first.
Oh, I have no idea.
I think the Didache is by far. I don't think you can even tell me. I don't even think the Didache is a document, right? Like I think the Didache is so far beyond corruption that it's almost not worth talking about in its current form. And scholars who accept it, and even sometimes give it a dating of like 60, which I find unbelievable, actually. They just skirt around this issue and use a footnote. Same with Ignatius. They get a footnote to these things about how there's different endings to the Didache in different languages and different manuscripts. And then they sometimes skirt around this idea that there was once a text called the Dua Vitae, and that text then became the Didache. And then they move on again. And you think, well, hold on. That's quite important. You know, if I somehow took Tolkien's story of the Lord of the Rings and called it the Lords of England, and it was also about some rings and some guys that use those rings, and there was a guy called Gimli and Frodo and whatever, someone would do me for plagiarism and say that text is rubbish, it can't be trusted, just ignore it, read Tolkien. But yet in the case of the Didache, everyone says, well, it may or may not be a completely separate document with completely different intentions and motives that were not about methodological practices in the church. But don't worry about that, because that's what it is now, and what it is now is all that matters. I think people are as dogmatic and stubborn on the Didache as they are Paul and the Gospel sometimes, because it absolutely helps them out. But I don't think you have, unlike Irenaeus, I don't think the same is true of Irenaeus or even Ignatius, really. But on the Didache, I would challenge you that I don't think there is a recoverable text of an original text in the Didache. I don't think it's there. I think that it probably is in there somewhere, but for you to be able to recover it, I think would be so tough.
Maybe that's your next book.
Unfortunately, Dr. Price, I'm going to have to leave academia after this because there's no jobs, and I'm getting married, so it's a gutting predicament, but there we go. But my next project really wants to be on 1 Clement. Undoubtedly a composite text also. I have no doubt in my mind that's true. The question is how much of it is late and how much of it is early. Again, that will take the same brute work of stylistic lexicon, counting words every day for the next 5 years. But that's what you've got to do. I mean, you can't just feel your way around it or look for some of the big theologies. You've got to look at methods and styles of the author if you're gonna really work out the text. But it's so boring, and that's why I get why scholars don't want to do it. It's so rubbish, and I hate it, especially when you spend 5 days on one verse. I mean, that really is soul destroying. And that's happened. That's not a tale. That's not a tale like Ignatius. That's a true story.
I believe you.
Wow.
That's a lot of work. There's one more super chat I just want to get you just real quick. Elias Moody again, thank you for your super chat. Also, when is the blog dropping and the Patreon? I think crowdfunding is the only way to bypass the dogmatic barriers of academia and make progress. Well, I did put the Patreon link in the description. I also put it in the live chat. So
thank you.
That's very kind.
That's very kind. So in terms of the academic community, like, to be fair, although they give me a short, sharp thrift on my Marcy and Pauline thoughts, they are very receptive. Or sorry, not very. That's the wrong adjective. they are more receptive to my Ignatian scholarship. And they are interested in it. They're skeptical of it because of its implications. They're worried that it means that Paul wasn't written in the 50s and 60s, and they're worried that Matthew wasn't written before the 2nd century. But they are willing to hear it out. And I think that I probably, if I was single and didn't have any financial responsibilities, i.e. I could live on 15,000 euros a year in Germany, which is a job I was offered, yeah, you can make your way. But when you're getting married and you want to live a normal life rather than living out of a bin bag, which I've done for the last 10 years in academia, you've got to move on and sort yourself out. The other thing I'd say is that academia is also trending away from this dry material, textual-based stuff. They're really interested in modern topics, inclusivity, diversity, gender, race, slavery. They love stuff on slavery. That's what they want to hear. And if you get all those buzzwords in a grant application, then you're a shoo-in. But the really crappy, boring stuff, which only losers like myself and you two and Marcus, I include us all in the losers box here, really want to know about.
Yes, me, yeah.
That sort of stuff just isn't trendy. People don't want to read it. It doesn't sell books. And again,
right.
I kind of get that. Like, I understand that you've got to make money. But on the flip side, I can't believe we're still arguing over a canonical Pauline text that is quite clearly corrupted. Why are we even arguing about it? Let's try and work out what the text is first before we have a discussion, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think New Testament biblical scholarship is pretty much dead, which is why I started the Journal of Higher Criticism. I wanted to return to the glory days of yesteryear, where people would have bold, venturesome speculations and see what you can come up with. And I realize that. Oh, and the guff I get for being a mythicist. It's like Bart Ehrman. He will just freely admit that if he has anything to say about it, any job applicant who holds a crazy view like mythicism wouldn't be accepted, wouldn't be given a chance any more than a Christian Science practitioner would get a job at a hospital or something. So I realize I think it's great to have a little cottage industry of the like-minded, and it's not lucrative, but in a way it's exciting to go back to like the Tübingen pioneers, where they were in a minority, or the Dutch radicals, and where you're just doing it for the love of the subject and the love of knowledge. And some people, seeing that candle lit, want to come to it to get warm and get some light. And that is exciting in a way that no god-awful Society of Biblical Literature snooze fest would be. So where is it happening? Well, here among the Losers Club.
Yeah, I went to 2 conferences this year. I went to the BNTS conference in Scotland and a conference in Bertinoro, Italy. Of the two, the scenes were better in Bertinoro, so I'd recommend that one for anyone going. But one of the things that struck me though in both times is that in the case of the Bertinoro one, which was actually a lot of good people there. John Kloppenburg was there, and Marcus Vincent was there, and whatever. They were actually very open. And Marcus gave 3 papers about all of his wacky and weird beliefs that I share with him, and he was given good hearing actually, which is encouraging to see. And I think as well, in Germany, you can sometimes get that hearing as well. At the BNTS, lovely people, absolutely had a great time, met loads of new friends, whatever. But when it came to the scholarship, I gave a paper on the reception of Paul in the 3 letters, in which I basically said, Ignatius doesn't know Paul, get over it. That was my paper, essentially. And I stunned the room into silence. And at the end of it, something really telling happened. An Old Testament scholar came up to me. He said, I work on the book of Daniel mostly. And if we want to argue, let's say that Daniel references Exodus, we have to be so clear, and it has to be so obvious, and we have to give such strong arguments in favor of that being the case. Otherwise, we'll just get torn to shreds. He said, but it seems like the case of the New Testament world is that if the Apostolic Father uses two of the same words as Paul, well, howdy hoody, it's Pauline. That's a Pauline piece of work. And it doesn't matter whether those two words are in the same context or in the same order, even in the same sentence. They can be in the same chapter for all they care. It's Pauline. And so that's the sort of thing that worries me. And I remember sat down for lunch with with a lovely Pauline scholar, and I said to her, "So what do you think about the Marcionic epistles of Paul? Do you not think that they raise some difficulties for canonical Paul?" And she just said, "Well, I don't really know much about them, but they're obviously spurious." And then she moved on. She walked away from me, and I thought, "Oh, I sorry, what did I do wrong?" And so that is an issue. And look, I get that. I was saying this to Jacob just the other day, is that we still need scholars working on Paul, canonical Paul, that is, and working out the theology of him, because whether it's pre-Marcion or post-Marcion is not relevant. We still need people to help out researching it in its context, but we still have to also research the Marcion stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just neglect it, because whichever way you look at it, it's still part of Christian history.
Yeah, I really believe you should let 100 flowers bloom. I did. Who was it that said I was a nut and he didn't want to appear with me because in one book I go over the Pauline epistles from the Dutch radical standpoint, that he wrote none of them, and here's why. But in another book I say, you've probably already read what I had to say from that standpoint, but let's try to be as fair as we can with mainstream criticism and say that the lucky seven are by Paul. What sense would they make that way? Let's try to do an honest sketch of him that way. And it's not absurd to go either way. It's like you're looking at it through different lenses and interesting things pop up. But this guy said, he's crazy. He's like a multiple personality, apparently. But that's what you've got to do. Like Paul Feyerabend said, the only principle that does not inhibit research is anything goes. And who cares what the majority says? Who cares what you think about something? Go with it. It may be inconsistent with other views you hold, but pursue it and see what you get. And so I think all of these things, as you say, it's good that everybody's doing this stuff. It'd be a terrible error if one day everybody went insane and agreed with me. I
think one of the things that shocks me, though, is that I'm surprised by the amount or the strength of the defense given by secular scholars to these things. I mentioned often that I'm a traditional Roman Catholic who attends the Latin Mass, and so again, I have a lot of skin in this game and a lot to lose if it all goes Pete Tong. But the problem is that if Marcionite epistles predate Pauline epistles, that's true regardless of anything else you might feel. Now, as you know, I actually think they do predate the canonical epistles. I think Marcion has the genuine Pauline epistles, if anything of them remain. But I couldn't believe the defense given by secular scholars for these things, to the point where you'd think that they were traditional fundamentalist evangelical Protestants, that they're so strong in these things. And I thought, well, why am I getting the stick? I'm the one who's meant to believe this stuff. It's meant to change my life if it all goes wrong. And yet here we are. But back on the case, though, is that I think that one of the reasons that scholarship is overlooks them is because actually most scholarship is quite lazy. They want the low-hanging fruit. It's not romantic or enjoyable to count words all day. It's not romantic to do stuff like Adolf von Harnack. I think he's probably maybe the greatest person that's ever lived in my mind. But that his work is boring. And it means reading everything, and it means leaving nothing, and it means learning every language. That's another thing that I think scholarship has lost is the necessity to have Oriental languages. I'm at a great institution at King's College. Feel very blessed to be there. But last year they didn't teach Greek. Well, what do you want a generation of New Testament scholars to do if they don't speak Greek? What comes next? Who teaches Syriac? I tried to get a course in London. I couldn't.
Wow.
So the problem is that if we get the next generation of scholars who are just going for this low-hanging fruit are not going to be trained in languages, and or at least not in England. I speak most specifically to England here. this seems to be the growing things happening around me. Again, you go over to the continent, somewhere like Germany, Italy, they're still teaching quite well on these things, the languages. I mean, Syriac, I'm not so sure, but Greek, certainly, they take great pride in. So it just seems to me that the future of scholarship in the English-speaking world will very soon just be rubbish and dead. And they're closing departments as well. That's the other point to make. Is they're getting rid of scholars. They want them gone. They want to merge them with other departments, things like history or art, etc. So in 50 years' time, I think we're left with, in the English-speaking world, precious little, and we'll give it over to the Italians and Germans, probably would be my assumption. But I pray for a great revival of New Testament and but I think that's the other thing that holds us back, actually, is that the more I've progressed on this journey, separating patristic departments from New Testament departments is purely arbitrary, based on an ancient Christian bias.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as if the revelation is completed and then all of a sudden the Apostolic Fathers begin to write. Like, whose idea was that? Well, I know whose idea was. It was Christians. It was my lot's fault. But we can't continue to have that clear divide, because that's not what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that impedes scholarship. It means that we have 10,000 scholars working on 27 books, and then maybe half that number working on everyone from Revelation to probably about Augustine. That not good.
But I think this it's no accident that we have this regrettable phenomenon you mentioned earlier, where it's inclusivity and wokeness and all of that stuff. That happened at Drew University, where I went. When I was there were people that were really interested in the higher criticism, but then after I left, those people either died or retired, and the new people, one of who's I think the head of the department, probably, I'm not sure, he's all into deconstruction, which I like very much. I love his work, but it's like queer studies and gender this and that, and to me that's like, well, have fun with that, but that's just not, I regard, as biblical scholarship. And I think you're going to have more and more of that too. And I think
yeah, I think that there's actually a really interesting movement, and I actually really enjoy the work of a guy called Tarcisius Makuka. He's quite a smaller scholar, but he did a really interesting piece about, as someone who grew up in a colonial world, he's from Zambia, what it was like writing as someone in a colony, and then and he was also very good at languages, and he was a very good New Testament scholar. He then put sort of the element of living and writing in a colony into Paul, and an understanding as a colonized person what that looks like, and that sort of thing I think is massively valuable, because because he puts it in a position to think more like an oppressed people, which I've never been. My family are Irish, but I don't think that counts for me. In addition to that, I think someone like Joan Taylor does wonderful work on women in the Scripture, right? And again does great stuff on the role of women in the early church, in defense of women deacons. Again, Catholics, I'm not a fan of that personally, but maybe she's got a point. But the problem, I think, arises when we start to read into things. So I saw a Christian, he gave a paper on slavery in Paul, and he was from an ethnic minority, and he tried to argue that Paul really wanted to get rid of slavery. Like, that was a big element of Paul's ministry. And I think that the problem here, though, is that again, I'm the one trying to defend Paul as a Christian, but I think that kind of is a whitewashing of what Paul really was saying. I don't think Paul gave much of a monkeys. And in the case of Ignatius, he actually says slaves must never leave their owners. Like, he's so adamant about it. He says, because if they leave their owners, they become slaves to their own lust. I don't know what he means, but that's the words he uses. And I think we can't attempt to read people with such good intention with 21st century psychology. I understand there's a place for again, as a member of an ethnic minority, he has something to contribute as someone who, again, has faced oppression, who has faced being in a dangerous community, who faces prejudice, whatever. But he can't. I don't think you can go back and try and hope that your heroes didn't wish you enslaved, or at least not wish you enslaved, but weren't bothered.
My New Testament dissertation was called "The Widow Traditions in Luke Acts: A Feminist Critical Scrutiny." How's that for a mouthful? And the idea was the kind of thing that Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza does. My case was that I think she's right about the hermeneutic of suspicion, learning to read the silences, especially about women, but that she doesn't use it nearly enough. But I learned from her to use a particular lens of the oppressed to take a whole different look than I ever had at Luke and Acts and the pastorals. And I think the result is genuine scholarship. I'm not trying to crusade for some social goal. It just was, I don't think I was trying to read feminism into the New Testament. I thought, no, this woman, she's feminist. That's why she's interested in it. But it enables her to see something that is really in the text. So you can't be too cavalier with these, like you say about the guy with the colonial perspective. He can see something I wouldn't have. So good. I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well because as a Catholic, I would like to read into the Ignatian letters that all 13 of them are genuine because it completely justifies my position that only the Catholic Church is true from day one. But I should imagine I'd be absolutely crucified for that, and rightly so. But so it doesn't just go for some of those more some of those more modern concepts of in the feminist world or colonial worlds. It even goes for traditional Catholics. At the end of the day, that's essentially what I'm bullying Lightfoot and Zahn for, was reading what they wanted to into a text, which did not support it. And no matter how blinkered you want to be, it doesn't say that. And so I really welcome some of the new scholarship and the perspectives in it. I just ask that, in the same way I'm not allowed to read Everyone Was a Catholic from the death of Peter onwards, we can't do that with anything else either, necessarily. But it's also a minefield. I mean, I think you have to. I think it's a minefield because I don't think you can. In the old days, I don't think you could say something in scholarship without being absolutely ribbed for it. So what I mean by that is when you look at some of these German guys like Bauer, and again Harnack, if you said anything wrong, they would just pounce and they'd know everything about what you're wrong. I think of Mark Edwards actually at Oxford. He's someone like that. If you get one thing wrong, he knows. Like he knows even before you've opened your mouth, he knows you're wrong. Whereas now, I think when I read reviews of books, the reviewers, even after like time of research and looking at the book in detail, I'm not entirely sure they know what the problems are. Like it's almost like there's a lack of wider research involved in that. And that's why I think it's such a minefield, because I think people get away with more now than they maybe did against the fierce Germans of yesteryear.
By the way, I have a photo of Harnack on the wall over there, and F.C. Bauer, whatever you call it, the image of him to inspire me, along, of course, with Tillich, Bultmann, Schleiermacher, and it's just the gallery of saints here.
It might be ruining a surprise, but I'm pretty sure my fiance has got me a big picture of William Cureton for Christmas. I don't think I'm meant to know that, but I have a strong feeling, and I'm very excited to put it up above our fireplace. Not the future children. William Cureton first.
We got a super chat here. Elias Almighty, thank you for your super chat. Jack, I think you're influencing me too much because I've been working on a thesis that Paul wrote to 3 places instead of this accepted 7, Galatians and Corinthians being multiple letters.
Yeah.
Good.
Gosh, it's catching this critical thinking stuff, isn't it? Joe, it's funny because with the Pauline letters again, I've had access to Marx's new book, in which he is comparing Marcionite Paul, the canonical Paul, side by side, doing a fresh reconstruction, but also again studying the lexicons of the two texts and how they differ. And one of the things that struck me, though, again, was that it's clear to me that I don't think Marcion has anything. Well, sorry, Marcion's text is not genuinely Pauline. I think yet again, even his text, which I think is earlier than canonical Paul, is corrupted. So that raises the question then of again, where do we find original Paul? Like, where is he lurking in this jumbled mess? And I'd argue, although Marcus doesn't like it when I say this, that 1 Corinthians and Romans might be 2 of the keys to unlocking that puzzle. The reason why I say that is because 1 Corinthians in particular seems to be, and they're not very well attested at all, the Pauline epistles and the Apostolic Fathers, but of all of them, that's the only one you could maybe arguably say is present. I will then go through and see whether it is only shared, whether all the attested passages are also shared by the Marcionite collection, which, if they were, would be both unhelpful and helpful in some sense. But that being the case, in addition to that, we get from Apelles that he uses a gospel and an epistle. It doesn't say that he uses Marcion's Paul. It says that he takes a gospel, which we might assume is Marcion's, because I don't know what other gospel he might have, but he only ever refers to the one epistle of Apelles. And again, I wonder whether that's coincidence that 1 Corinthians is probably the most well attested, if any, of the Pauline letters we have, and yet Apelles is also known to have one epistle. Is it that one that he took? I mean, I don't know why it'd be that one. It doesn't strike me as anything particularly more impressive than Romans or whatever. I mean, I'd be really surprised if it was Philemon, that's to be fair. But, you know, you get my point. Is like, it's just strange that we'd only refer to one.
That is strange.
But and again, with 1 Corinthians, again, I'd have to compare it to the Marcionite one, but that could tell us something so deeply about Paul's original hand. If you could have a litmus test by which we could judge other Pauline texts, then we could do the grammar and syntax business again. But I mean, I agree that Paul's text. I mean, again, another one we need to look at is Philippians. What a mess! I mean, maybe 3 letters. I mean, it's not 1 letter. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's not 1 letter. But is Marcion's also not 1 letter? I don't know that yet. There's so many presents to open this Christmas that I need more people to help me open them.
Yeah.
But Elias Moody, I mean, I think you know, whatever you say at this moment, it's probably up for debate. Like, as long as it's not completely mental, then anything's open, really.
You know, this is President of what?
Thank you for the super chat constellation, Pegasus.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you elect me as VP? I'd appreciate that.
Oh, I should probably have you at the top of the ticket, though.
What am I supposed to be in there? Secretary of State.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
I would love to have you write anything you wanted for the Journal of Higher Criticism sometime. I mean, from what you say, I'm sure you could dash off a masterpiece of scholarship in about 15 minutes on any of a number of subjects. I would love to be able to publish anything you'd send my way.
Yeah, no, I'd like that. I'd like to contribute. I have so many things whirring in my brain at the minute that aren't that need to go down, really. And it's interesting as well because back on the subject of reception of critical scholarship, I actually had a paper accepted for the National American Patristic Society. So that's encouraging. That NAPS, who are, for those who don't know, probably one of the 2 largest patristic journals in the world, along with Studia Patristica, they're willing to hear this out too. So that's exciting, right? I mean, and again, Marcus runs Studia Patristica, so if he doesn't hear me out, then he's in trouble. He's not invited to the wedding. But but you know, that's good. But I wrote another paper, and I won't say to which journal I put it into. And the paper basically outlined a new method for assessing the dating of letters, or New Testament texts. And I gave that paper almost verbatim on this channel with James Valiant. And in it, my point is that one of the ways we can maybe begin to assess these texts is by putting them in an order of the evolution of a chosen topic. So I chose the topic of deacons, and I looked at every occasion where the word deacon as an office, not as the verb, appeared. And I looked at when it was used, how it was used, the theology it's applied to it, what roles they had, what roles they, exist alongside upon. And it was a really, really interesting paper, and I really enjoyed writing it. So I then sent it into this journal, and I was really excited. Marcus said he liked it. I thought, I'm in here. the guy read it and said, rather than looking at the new methodology, basically said, you don't understand what deacons are, and also you've never read Ignatius. And my jaw has hit the floor, and I was like, excuse me? Excuse me? Slag off my work on 1 Clement if you will, but come at me at Ignatius? I mean, that's like, kicking one of my children. So there was a real lack of willingness to see the point of it. It was a methodological argument more than it was about deacons. I couldn't give a fig about deacons in this paper. I'm interested, and again, my suggestion was that if colleagues would then join me in this task, that you would do the Eucharist and Jacob would do Christology and Marcus would do whatever, we could then plot a table to show the order of the progression of these things and see if a pattern emerged. I think the answer would be yes, because them's the breaks. If I'm wrong, I'll accept my methodology is bogus. That's fine. But it's got to be worth an estimate, because no one's really done this. And that shocked me, because it seems like the most basic thought.
I think the problem in general is there's been this academic trend to try to put everything as early as possible, create a narrow path, and putting what they think is most likely the truth on that path, on that block, and just say, screw it, we're not quite, this is the unquestionable truth, we'll never question it, this is it, and that is the end of it. Like putting the 7 letters in the 50s, the Gospels from 70 to 100, despite the issues that exist for those things, despite the fact there have been scholars that have questioned that time and time again for the last couple of centuries, and yet they dismiss those scholars like they never existed, and it's like, oh, let's play make believe. They never existed, and the narrow path hasn't been questioned.
It's interesting you say that about the dismissal of our predecessors. I mean, you look at William Cureton, or Tourmel is another one, the French theologian who wrote under pseudonyms like Delafosse and things like that. Unfortunately, he got booted out of my team, got excommunicated. But people don't mention these guys. Like but they have so much to contribute. I go as far as to say that although the world still agrees with you and I that Harnack is still one of the idols and is to be held in high esteem, I don't think people have read him. I don't think scholars have read him. The reason why I say that is because so many times I come across Harnack's comments on a subject. So then I look through all of the bibliographies of other secondary literature, and nobody talks about his edition. And that does really confuse me. I mean, the other one in particular is on Papias, right? He mentions that he saw Papias's work in Eastern Europe, in Poland, I think it was. He mentions he found it. Then World War I kicked off, and they moved the library from Poland to Vienna. I think it's Vienna. Again, now look at me. I sound like I haven't read it, but I think it's Vienna. And in it, he then says, "Well, I then went back after the war, and I couldn't find it." Now, stupid Adolf von Harnack should have transcribed it first time, dum-dum, and that is something I'll never forgive him for. But why is scholarship not up in arms trying to find this? Okay, it could be a goose chase. He might have mistaken it. It could be spurious. It could be a forgery. But if he found Papias, that might just put all of us out of a job. I mean, like, if it was genuinely Papias, we might be bunched. As we forget higher critical studies, we'll just go home. We'll close the channel and say goodnight. But again, if people had actually read Harnack, why don't they know that? Why aren't we clamoring to find this text? Why is it someone put in a massive multi-million-pound research grant?
I would love to know what the volumes of Papias says.
You know that.
Yeah, follow me.
I'd have put in. Look, I was going to say, yeah. No, go on.
I think maybe the upcoming 5th Indiana Jones movie might be about that. You know, you can find. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure Harnack in the hat and the whip would quite do it.
I don't think so either. That would be hilarious. Indiana Jones and a lost Papias.
Yeah,
well, I mean, I'd go and see it.
Yeah, I would too. We'd see it together.
And it probably wouldn't be any more fictional to the ones that have been written thus far anyway. So, I mean, who knows? But the point is that back to the scholarship question, Why is no one reading these guys? Again, Turmel's another one who I came across. I think the first person to read Turmel since he wrote and comment on his work on Ignatius was Roger Parvou in 2008. Like that's some of the early stuff I could find for it, and it's a complete dismissal. They focus on the people they want to focus on.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no real engagement, and I think that's just such a tragedy.
I was debating somebody and mentioned that we're not so sure Paul wrote Galatians, and this guy just laughed and said it was absurd. Yeah. And I thought, do you not know that there's a scholarly tradition about this, that Rudolf Steck, Karl Barth's teacher, denied the Pauline authorship, not to mention the Dutch radicals and all. He just didn't have any idea because he's in the stuck in the what I call the magisterium of the the SBL caucus. It's or how about another one of our pals, Richard Carrier, says you don't need to read anything before this century. Oh my God.
I have great respect for Bart Ehrman, and I do respect.
He's excellent in many ways. Yes.
But there's no doubt that he'd probably be more accepted in my Tridentine Catholic community than I am for my opinions on these things, because at least he holds to them. I get a lot of grief from traditional Catholic. I only attend the Latin Mass, which is very traditional, but I get a lot of stick for this because no one wants to hear where I am. Whereas Bart Ehrman, he's fit right into place. And but again, it's that thing of it's okay. I think there is. I gave again on Jacob's channel just last week the two scenarios of the Pauline letters and the relationship between Marcy and canonical Paul. Go back and watch it. Jacob and I said it's the most fun he's had with me, and I agree. I've had the most fun doing that one last week. But in it, I said I'm willing to accept both scenarios, or three scenarios. Scenario one, canonical Paul was first, Marcionite redacted it. Scenario two, Marcionite Paul is first, Catholics redacted it. Or number three, the position I do hold, we have nothing left that's really Pauline, both are corrupted, the end. But the problem is, I'm willing to accept all three of those positions. I lean towards the last one because I think it makes the most sense with the evidence I have. But the idea that I could then just say to anyone who believes in canonical Paul, you're an idiot and you've got no evidence and you're clearly unlearned.
Yeah,
I can't say that. But people are more than happy to say that to me. And I'm not the one positing anything. I'm just saying, here's an idea and some questions I have for you. Can you answer those questions? No, you can't answer those questions. Oh dear. Now what we're going to do?
That's right. We got a super chat question here. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. When does the first writing of the devil appear in Genesis? There was no devil involved originally by Hebrew thought. I was wondering about this for a while. The Satan and devil are different people.
And neither one of them exists. The serpent is certainly not said to be the devil or Satan. Satan and devil kind of both mean the same thing. I understand the Satan is the opponent, the adversary, the prosecutor, whereas diabolos means the hurler, like the caster of aspersions, the accuser of our brethren. But neither one of those comes up in Genesis.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the Genesis story because I am a peasant in Hebrew Bible stuff. But in early church stuff, there was a really interesting article written that wasn't published in a journal, only on academia.com, I think, that was called The Lost Devil or something like that, which is basically that after apparently the New Testament is written, the devil goes in the bin. And nobody knows who he is for a bit and forgets about him. And when I looked at the Ignatian epistles, they differ. For example, in the three-letter collection, we only have the ruler of this age. But yet when we get to the 7 letters, who makes a lovely appearance, it's Mr. Satanas. So somehow in that gap, Satan himself has managed to get himself into the story proper, rather than just being the ruler of this age, ambiguous. Mr. Diabolos comes up again, not in Ignatius but in other literature. Satanas then comes back into play, and we seem to get some more pronounced thoughts about him. We also get Beelzebub pop up as well, but these are much later. The Apostolic Fathers are not big ones for devil action, as it were. So again, something that has to be answered among New Testament colleagues. Did he disappear? Did he do a magic act? I mean, you've got to account for that somehow, unless you believe as we do, or as well as I do, that this New Testament business is actually late 2nd century.
Wow. The fact that there were bishops named Lucifer, does that mean anything? That would you name a Christian Lucifer if that automatically meant devil? I don't think so.
I mean, I think you think about that in terms of England. I mean, I think if I walked down the street and found out my friend had named their kid Adolf, there'd be something on there, right? Someone would be a bit miffed. So yeah, I agree for the same reasons. Like, surely that would have been same with Judas. I mean, okay, we do have other Judases, but they seem to be more contemporary with the other Judas. I.e., when they named their child, they didn't know Judas was about to do what he was at. But if you're a 3rd, 4th century bishop and you have a nephew and your sister calls it Judas, you're going to say, "What? What did you call that kid?" Whereas, why didn't you go with Theophorous? That's a lovely name.
Oh boy, fascinating. So, is your dissertation, I assume, about Ignatius and the different versions, the different collections, and all that?
Yeah, my thesis tries to prove that the 3 predate the 7. It doesn't assume an authorship, as I have done here today. It doesn't assume a strict dating. And it's interesting because even Alan Brent, who is a good friend and one of the largest advocates for the 7S collection, he's very, very precarious on his dating as well of Ignatius. And if he could be so cautious, who am I to dare throw to just throw out there. But so the primary end, because I think that's the starting point for scholarship, is if they can begin to recognise that the 3 letters predates the 7, well, then we can discuss other stuff and actually work as a team. At which point, I'll then leave Ignatius and go on to ruin someone else's text, like 1 Clement. But I think that the position that Marcus started his 2019 book, Writing Early Christianity, I think is actually enough on its own. To convince me. I mean, I actually became a Catholic because of Ignatius of Antioch's letters. And when he told me in 2018 that they weren't genuine, I almost exploded at him in a master's class. I thought he was a right little, so-and-so, and I wanted to give him what for. So he sent me early proofs of his book, and he only dedicates 1 chapter, probably only 150 pages, to Ignatian question. And in about 2 days, I was convinced and said, I'm going to write a dissertation on it. And he went, oh, okay, fine, you can do that. So I've only further confirmed what he thought, but most importantly, what William Cureton thought. And that's something that I feel very passionate about, is allowing these people the limelight, because he was crushed by Lightfoot in 1885 and 1889, absolutely crushed and never allowed to speak again. And, we get to provide not literature for our day even necessarily, but for the future, just like Cureton did. You and I might not be listened to now, but someone will pick us back up again. And allow those things to breathe. But yeah, so my dissertation is almost finished. I hope to publish it naturally. And then I'd like to embark, before rampaging into Clement, a fresh translation of the Syriac Epistles, both into Greek and into English. Now, scholarship doesn't like when you translate Syriac into Greek, or anything really. They don't like the Septuagint either, for that matter, for the same reasons. But I think that it's necessary because we know it came from a Greek translation. And in addition to that, if we're going to actually perform full of comparisons between the 7 letters in Greek, it'd be much easier to translate the Syriac into Greek to compare rather than the Greek into Syriac, which would be completely bonkers. So I'd like to do that, and also provide a fresh translation in English, because my hope would be that if people now start to believe me and Marcus, then people will want copies of the Syriac translation. They'll need that. And so I hope that's something that they'll find useful as a community. What they really need as a community is that critical edition. But unfortunately, that might not go untouched for another 100 years, because I don't think in my lifetime I'll ever have the opportunity to do it unless I win the lottery, which is a great tragedy for me. It breaks my heart, honestly, but we might have to wait a long time for it, but that's what we need.
Let's take this super chat question, and then I think we could close out after this. Last, Moody, thank you for your super chat. I remember asking Dale Martin what he thought of the anti-Marcionite prologue to John, which places the antithesis and John as contemporaries, and he said he has no idea what that is. I was shocked.
Oh, the pain.
The antitheses of Marcion?
Yeah. You know what's interesting, for those that don't know, is the anti-Marcionite prologue goes further than that. It actually claims Papias wrote the Gospel of John. Very fascinating to read it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where did Eisler, I just forgotten, I read this, but he says that in Papias there is a reference to Marcion having been the amanuensis of John, and that when John saw that he had smuggled some of his views into the gospel, he fired him, but apparently didn't excise those passages. And of course, to me, implies that it's just a way some ancient had of trying to explain away the Marcionite sounding material in John.
So what the text? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I forget where that. I think that was one of these prologues.
Okay.
I'll have to look it up.
What it says is that Marcion read the Gospel of John and he got mad.
Yeah,
he didn't like it, and he didn't write it. Papias, it claims that John dictated the Gospel to Papias. And then Marcion read it, and he got super heated, angry about it, and he was thrown out of the church by his father, who happens to be John, something like that, which is interesting.
Yeah, and so the problem with these tales, though, is that they are perhaps very tall.
One more thing. Okay, it doesn't say that John is his father. It was Agapius that claimed that Marcion's father excommunicated him from the church, but Agapius doesn't name the person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So just correcting myself there.
You did well to plug that up, because my brain wasn't going to pick that up. Well done.
Oh, and by the way, I agree. This thing about Marcion working for John, I don't assume that's true. I think it sounds like somebody's later attempt to say, well, there is some stuff in here no one has ever seen God. And oh, wait a second, that sounds kind of Marcionite. Maybe Marcion snuck it in some way, but of course, if he had been taken out, but I have to look at a possible Sitzum Laban of that sort, and that this is just, if anything, I mean, if we can posit any explanation, it would be that it's just sort of a myth to explain an odd thing in John.
Well, if it's all right with you two, I'd like to go ahead and close out. I think we pretty much got everything in for today. And I thank everybody who super chatted their questions today. Really appreciate the support. It helps me keep this channel going. And don't forget that that Jet Bull's Patreon link is in the description below and floating in the chat. I guess we could end with this last super chat question. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Why would Marcion throw a fit on the Gospel of John? I don't know. That's just what the text says. It doesn't elaborate further.
Well, I mean, you could see. Let's say in some mad world that Marcion had the full Gospel of John as we have it canonically, right? I don't think that's true even from for a second.
I agree he would have been upset by it. I'm just saying the text doesn't tell us.
Oh, yeah. But we could infer that, though, that he has the full canonical John in front of him. I mean, I think it's obvious why he'd be fuming. I mean, you have a very touchy-feely real Jesus, number one, who clearly is also a person. He doesn't just descend. There's no cognito descensus, as Schleer put it. You have Eucharistic stuff about, again, tangibility of Jesus, that my sarks, my hymer, eat and drink. I mean, for Marcion, that would have given him the heebie-jeebies, or in this case, the furies. But either way, I mean, this is why I think, most importantly, John was written, was because Marcion wrote a gospel, and the Catholics said, actually, we hate this one. We need to make one that really hates Marcion, and they consider that to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I think that's why they were written, as a response to them, to wind up Marcy on. But that is a terrible place to leave a podcast, so that means you have to tune in next time.
For sure, we definitely need to get back there. This was really fun, and
You bet.
and I'll just say once again, I thank everybody for their super chats, and I'll see both of you later. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.